My name is Mark Morton. I work at the Center for Teaching Excellence at the University of Waterloo, and this presentation is called Smartphone Pedagogy. I want to start by showing you a few slides of statistics. With this first one, you'll see that it pertains to the percentage of undergraduates who own a smartphone, and that percentage has risen over the last couple of years. It's gone from 55% in 2011 to 77% in 2013. And this data is drawn from an ECAR study of undergraduate students and information technology that was published in 2013. On this slide, you'll see that there are two data sets. The first one is about the percentage of students who use their smartphones for academic work, and this has risen from 40% in 2011 to 60% in 2012. Next, you'll see that the percentage of students who perceive smartphones as being important for their academic work has also gone up. It's gone up from 35% in 2011 to 50% in 2012. Now have a look at this statistic. In 2013, 2 out of 3 students said they want their instructor to use their learning management system more. But now contrast those foregoing statistics with this. The percentage of students who rate mobile devices as good or excellent with regard to accessing their learning management system has actually dropped over the past couple of years. In 2012, it was 68%, and in 2013, it dropped to 59%. So this is a significant contrast. We have an increasing percentage of students who actually own a smartphone. We have an increasing percentage of students who see smartphones as being important for their academic work. And we have a very large percentage of students who want their instructor to use their learning management system more. But their satisfaction with using mobile devices like smartphones to access their learning management system is actually dropping. So I think there's a problem here. So when it comes to learning management systems and smartphones and other small mobile devices, I think the problem is this, that essentially we've been trying to put square pegs into round holes. And now I'm going to try to explain what I mean by that, and then I'm going to go on to suggest a solution. What you see on this slide are two views of the same page from a learning management system. The image on the left-hand side is what you see when you view that page from a typical desktop computer screen, and you'll notice that it's quite large and legible. And what you see on the top right-hand side is the same page when you view it on a typical smartphone, specifically an iPhone. And it's obviously much smaller, almost impossible to read, and that remains the case even if you hold it closer to your eyes. It's still almost impossible to read that page on a smartphone. You can, of course, on a smartphone, zoom in on the text of that page that you're looking at, and that's what I've done here in the top right corner of the slide. I've zoomed in on the web page in the LMS, and it does make the text larger and readable, but as you'll see, then another problem arises. Namely, that as you zoom in and increase the size of the text, you start to lose part of the text, or rather it's like looking through a small window onto a much larger scene. You only see a section of the page at a time. And if seeing only part of the screen is a problem when you're trying to read an LMS page, it's even more of a problem, I think, when you're trying to write something in an LMS page, like an online discussion forum. It becomes almost impossible to do so. You have to scroll back and forth as you're typing. And lastly, just to really bring this point home, if you then zoom out and try to write in the Learning Management System page on a smartphone, then this is what you get. You do get the full window to type in, but again, it becomes almost impossible to see what you are typing because it's so tiny. Now, before I proceed to the next stage of my argument, I just want to propose an analogy for you to keep in the back of your head. What we have here on this slide are two photographs of people reading newspapers. On the left-hand side, it looks like it's businessmen reading on a park bench. They're reading a German broadsheet. And on the right-hand side, it looks like we have an individual on a subway or a trolley, and he's reading what is known as a tabloid newspaper. Now, a learning management system is essentially a communication tool, and I'd like to propose something that's fairly obvious. Namely, that whenever it comes to communication, there are three components or three aspects. First, you have the content, that is the what that is being communicated. Second, you have the medium, and that refers to how it is being communicated. And third, you also have the context, and that refers to where it is being communicated, or where the audience, the recipient of the communication, is when they are receiving that communication. Now, before I bring this back to learning management systems and smartphones, I want to bring in a couple of analogies. Essentially, what I want to suggest is this: that with regard to these three components of content, medium, and context, that if a change happens to any one of them, it necessitates a change happening to the other two. So, with my first analogy, think about this. 3D film technology is a medium that has emerged, or perhaps re-emerged with new vigor in the past few years. And this change to the medium of film in turn has had an impact on the content and context of film. This is what I mean. I would suggest that the change to 3D film technology, the change to that medium, has had this impact on content, namely that it's resulted in a resurgence of action films. To put it another way, 3D film technology is especially suited to action films. I don't think you see many dramas or love stories that have been 3D films. They tend instead to be action films or science fiction films, those kinds of movies. So this change in medium has definitely had an impact on the content of films. But additionally, as we'll see in the next slide, the change to 3D film technology, to that medium, didn't just have an impact on the content, but also has had an impact on the context. What I mean is that up until the resurgence of 3D film technology, theaters were actually dying. Fewer people were going to theaters because they could simply watch movies at home, either on DVD or streaming over the internet. But with 3D films, you really do need to be in a theater, at least at present. As a result, this has had an impact on theaters, and theaters are actually doing much better since the introduction or reintroduction of 3D films than they were a few years ago. So just to reiterate, with these three communication components, content, medium, and context, when a change happens to one of them, it causes a change to happen to the other two. I'm going to give you one more example of this before we come back to learning management systems and smartphones. For my second analogy, think back to the late 19th century or early 20th century when mass transit suddenly began to really grow in major cities across North America and Europe. Subways and streetcars and things like that, they began to flourish. So the context of where people were when they traveled changed. They were no longer walking on sidewalks or riding in horse-driven carts. Instead, they were now in big metal containers on wheels. And this change in context, in turn, had an impact on the other two components. Specifically, the boom in subways, streetcars, and other forms of mass transit had an impact on the medium of newspapers. Now, newspapers, of course, had been around for a long time before the late 19th century, but the impact that mass transit had on newspapers was this. It led to a huge increase in tabloid newspapers. Tabloid newspapers are newspapers that are not as tall or wide as the traditional kind of newspaper. Tabloid newspapers are simply easier to read and hold on a subway train or a streetcar. They are better suited to that form of transportation. Further, I would suggest that these changes to the context of where people read newspapers, namely reading them more and more on subways and streetcars, and also the attendant impact it had on the size of newspapers, the shift from broadsheet newspapers to tabloid newspapers, also had an impact on the content of those newspapers. What I mean is this, that tabloid newspapers are quite well known for being much more focused on celebrity news, Hollywood gossip, crime stories, things that involve spectacle. Now I'll give you an example of what I mean in the next slide. Here are 5 different German newspapers. The one on the extreme left is a traditional broadsheet newspaper. You'll see that it is very text heavy and there aren't even any photographs on the front page. On the extreme right hand side is a German tabloid newspaper, and you'll see that it is much more bold in its approach. It's got huge headlines, photographs all over it. Even the photo that happens to be at the top of it here is a kind of salacious photo. Obviously the content in the broadsheet and the content in the tabloid newspaper are very different. Now just one more bit of evidence before we bring this back to the learning management system and smartphone issue. I want to read this quote that appeared in a business magazine. On the New York subway recently, Joanne Tehrani, 26, was happily reading AM New York, one of the new tabloids being distributed for free in several metropolitan areas. I like the convenience of it, she said. I don't have to go to the newsstand, and I get these perfect little doses of news, which is just right for this ride. So, in short, the very content of a tabloid newspaper is shaped by where it is read and by the size of that newspaper. So when it comes to any communication, the content, the medium, and the context are all aligned with one another. Or at least they should be aligned if that communication is going to be effective. So now that we've had some practice with this approach, let's apply it to smartphones. I would suggest that they are a medium that has arisen in the past few years and that they have had an impact on the context of where people consume information. Specifically, since the advent of smartphones and other tablet devices, the context, that is the location, of where information is consumed has changed. It's changed to become much more informal, so places like cafes, couches, in bed, people are consuming information in those kinds of places to a much greater degree than they did before the advent of smartphones and other mobile devices. But what about content? How has content, specifically learning management system content, changed with regard to smartphones? Well, I would suggest that content, when it comes to learning management systems, has not changed since the advent of smartphones and other mobile devices, and that this has led to a misalignment that is really kind of causing a breakdown in this specific kind of communication. And it results in what we saw at the beginning of this presentation, where a growing number of students have smartphones, a growing number of them believe it's important for their academic studies, and a significant percentage of students want their instructors to use their learning management systems more. But a growing number of students are also dissatisfied with using a smartphone to access their learning management system. So we need a solution, and that's what I'm going to turn to now. So the solution that I'm going to suggest is that content for learning management systems, or at least when it comes to learning management systems being accessed by smartphones, is that they need to shift toward or integrate something that I'm going to call glimpse concepts. What are glimpse concepts? Well, I would suggest that they are analogous to, but distinct from, another concept which you might have heard of called threshold concepts. Threshold concepts are like portals. That is, they are like a cognitive gateway through which students must pass in order to experience a paradigm shift that will transform how they think about a discipline. I'm suggesting that glimpse concepts are like portholes. They are windows through which students get a quick look at key ideas or landmarks in a discipline's topography. Or if you want a different visual metaphor for what glimpse concepts are, they are like hooks that you hang in pegboards to hold tools that you will acquire later on. Now, I like visual metaphors and analogies, so please bear with me while I give you one more as I try to explain what glimpse concepts are, and after that I'm going to give you some examples of glimpse concepts as well. So, This is a photograph of the night sky, and if you know a little bit about constellations, you might even recognize the constellation that is depicted here. It's Orion. But if you said to a student, "This is the constellation Orion," and simply presented them with this photograph of the night sky, they might not really know what you're talking about. They might say, "Which stars? What is it supposed to form?" So you have to give them some further information. So what you might do to assist students is you might take the photograph and enhance it by highlighting the stars that form the constellation of Orion and labeling them with the names of the stars. To me, this is analogous to what glimpse concepts do. They provide an overview, or the word I like to use is that it provides a topography of the discipline or the concept in question. What it then allows students to do is this, as you'll see on the next slide. It allows students, or puts them in a position where they can then make connections between those landmarks in the topography of that system of knowledge. They can connect the glimpse concepts, or the stars in this case, and out of those connections they begin to see the contours of that body of knowledge. And once they have the contours, once they can see the topography of that body of knowledge, then they can begin to deepen it. And that, to me, would be analogous to providing them with information about the myth of Orion, who he was, who he fought, when he was believed in, things like that. So the last thing I want to do is give you some actual examples of what I consider to be glimpse concepts. And I'm going to use linguistics, and specifically etymology, the study of word origins, as the discipline for these glimpse concepts. Here's my first glimpse concept framed as a question. Are crayfish a kind of fish? Now, even before we look at the answer, I want to point out a couple of things. The text for this question easily fits on the screen of the iPhone, and there's even room for an image, which should help to reinforce the text-based question. The answer to the question, are crayfish a kind of fish, is no. They're a crustacean. The fish part of the name arose as an unwitting corruption of their French name, crevice. This French name in turn came from the old German word krabitz, meaning crab. Linguistic corruption occurs when people alter a word's spelling or pronunciation due to a misunderstanding. You'll see the word corruption is in red, and that really is the glimpse concept that I want to convey through this question. This idea of linguistic corruption is one of the pegs or landmarks in the study of etymology. So that's one glimpse concept, which would correspond figuratively, let's say, to one of the stars in the constellation of Orion. Okay, here's another question that I'm using to convey another glimpse concept in the field of etymology. Does the word crap derive from the surname of the inventor of the toilet, Thomas Crapper? True or false? The answer is false. Thomas Crapper did help popularize the flush toilet in the 19th century, but the word crap is much older. It derives from the medieval Latin crappa, which denoted the inedible husks of corn or other grains. The mistaken crapper origin is an example of a false etymology. So this is another glimpse concept in the field of etymology, namely false etymologies, and etymology that arises and becomes popular but is really incorrect. Okay, two more glimpse concepts. First, what can you tell about a word in English if it ends in ICK rather than IC? Well, words that end in ICK, like the word stick, derive from Anglo-Saxon. That is, they arose in Old English. Words that end in IC, like the words public or academic, derive from Latin. So the glimpse concept that is represented here is that the orthography, the spelling of a word, can reveal its origin. Here's my final glimpse concept. Why is the word love spelt with an O, even though its vowel is pronounced like a U, as in the word but? Here's the answer and the corresponding glimpse concept. English spelling is extremely erratic due to many different historical factors. One factor is that after the Normans, who spoke French, conquered England in 1066, the French system of handwriting was adopted. In that writing system, the letter U and the letter V were identical. Thus, to avoid confusing those two letters, O was used instead of U when it appeared in front of the letter V. So the glimpse concept is this. In linguistics, specifically in etymology, there is a reason for absolutely everything. That doesn't mean that we will always be able to figure out or divine the reason, but there is a reason for everything. In other words, randomness does not really exist when it comes to etymology. Things are driven by choices that people make for whatever reason. This too is another important glimpse concept in the field of etymology. In summary, this has been my argument. First of all, statistics show that there is an increasing percentage of students who have smartphones. There's also an increasing percentage of students who see smartphones as important to their academic work. And there is an increase in the percentage of students who want their instructors to use a learning management system in their courses. Set against all those things, though, is the fact that students are increasingly dissatisfied with their experience of accessing a learning management system with a smartphone. I then put forth this idea that there are three components in any communication system. Those components are the content, or what is being conveyed, the medium, or how it's being conveyed, and the context, or where it's being conveyed, or where it's being consumed. I suggested that with regard to smartphones, there is a misalignment in those three things, and as a result, that's why smartphones, from a student's perspective, have not been very effective at accessing their learning management systems. I would further suggest that glimpse concepts provide a pedagogy that can help to resolve this problem. So glimpse concepts are concepts that provide an overview, the topography of a body of knowledge. They define the contours or the shape of that body of knowledge. Once students have those glimpse concepts, then they can begin to connect them like a constellation. They can begin to deepen their knowledge, and this can happen in the classroom, or it can happen in the other components of a learning management system. So I'm not suggesting that glimpse concepts should replace the traditional content of learning management systems. I'm simply saying that they should be integrated into a course, into a learning management system, and that they become the content that students access when they are using a smartphone. When those students are at their desk and using their desktop computer, then they can access all the other components of the learning management system. And, like I said, those other components can help to deepen their knowledge and to make connections between the cluster of glimpse concepts that they have learned through their smartphones. So that's my basic argument. My name is Mark Morton, and if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me at mmorton@uwaterloo.ca.